Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Yeshiva League Pass Faceoff. I'm your host, Josh Kast, and we are sponsored by the Weiselberg Law Firm. For 16 years, you've entrusted Elliot with the growth and guidance of your kids, and now it's time to let him do the same for your family's most important asset, your home. Admitted in both New York and New Jersey, Elliot can help guide you through any residential or commercial purchase, sale, refinance, or lease with championship quality and award-winning care. If you're looking for your commercial coach or a new home is your goal, please reach out to the Weiselberg Law Real Estate Services today at 917-952-2597, or you can email them at wiselawsk@gmail.com. Reminding everybody once again, that's the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely. And here we are, the 10th episode of Yeshiva League Pass Face-Off, and it is our final episode of our third season. And if you caught the 9th episode and you heard a little bit of a preview coming your way, then you know what we're going to talk about. For those of you who don't, this is our sort of what we can look forward to for next season episode regarding the varsity league. And it's very similar to JV. We're just going to go through all the teams. And although we do have more teams in varsity to talk about, so we are going to try to group them into categories a little bit. But with that being said, we're going to talk about the teams in varsity and some of what we really expect will be happening next year. And it will be a little bit easier to predict, so to speak, what will happen with these varsity team next year. With these varsity teams next year, because we've seen most of them play as teams before on the JV level, and that was 2 years ago. So it will be a great time. And without further ado, let's get right into it. So last time I started in the Western Conference. So this time I'm going to start in the Eastern Conference. And we're going to start with, again, we'll go from the bottom of the regular season standings and the divisions upward. So we're going to start with Solomon Schechter. And Solomon Schechter is a team that did not have a fantastic regular season. They only went 12-2 on the regular season. Excuse me, not 12-2, 2-12. My apologies. And with that being said, there really wasn't so much to look for on this team. However, they do have a handful of players who will be returning next year as seniors. And that was one of the things about Solomon Schechter, is that most of the juniors this year have been on this varsity team since ninth grade. So we have seen these guys come in and really rise through their years, and they've gotten a little bit better year after year. Remember, no wins in their first year, 1 win the year after, 2 wins this year, so they're slowly climbing, and building their reputation up as a better team year after year. Where their ceiling is next year, I'm really not sure. It's also going to depend on who comes into the school and who ends up playing for them. But, it will be interesting to look out for. That's going to bring us on to the next team, North Shore. North Shore only went 3-11 this year. They were 1 win ahead of Solomon Schechter in the standings. And this is a team that 2 years ago on the JV level, or if you take what will be their varsity team next year and go back 2 years from when they were JV, they were actually quite good. I believe they went 7-1-2. They went to the semifinals and lost to TABC. However, they were a really interesting team. Elijah Kuehl, obviously, who is not with North Shore, wasn't with North Shore this past year. I would assume will not be back with them next year after transferring to SAR. And, with that being said, he was a big part of that team. He scored big goal after big goal for them. And he was a big reason why they had so much success. He was able to take over games left and right against everyone. Even though they didn't win these games necessarily, but he did it at times against DRS. He did it at times against teams like Flatbush and MTA, who were big teams, that year on the JV level. And I don't want to take away from other guys like Jonah Glassman and Ben Muller, who have both been doing it the last, two years or so, because both of them didn't really have such impactful roles when they were ninth graders. However, last year, both of them were impactful on the JV level. This year, they were both impactful on the varsity level, just really not so much else around that North Shore team. And Ryan Stolwark will likely be in net for them next year. He's going to be one of the better goaltenders in the league next year on the varsity level. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. The other thing is North Shore last year had a JV team and a varsity team. This year, they only had a varsity team. So the guys who were on that JV team, who played on that competitive JV team that went to the semis, came up to the varsity league this year, even if they were in 9th or 10th grade. And even if they didn't have such a successful regular season, which I think, with all due respect, they did not, only going 3-11, they got some good experience playing against varsity level players, and they'll probably make them stronger for next year. So I'm interested to see what happens with them and how they can make adjustments without Elijah Kuehl going into the next year, because obviously it was a big piece for them. But as I mentioned, they still have guys who will certainly be able to pick up the slack, and we'll see where they go from here. That's going to move us on to YDE. They're the next team we have to talk about. YDE went 6-8 this year in the varsity league, and they were just a little bit short of the playoffs by 3 points. This is a team that had not so many guys on their team in terms of the depth and bodies as a whole. However, looking at their roster, most of their players were actually 11th graders. And for them to have gone 6-8, it was really more of a learning experience year because, yes, they made the playoffs the year before, but they got shelled by SAR. And they had a lot of key 12th graders on that team. And they're really only going to be losing, maybe at most. I mean, not at most, because, the way YDE has played over the last couple of years, all their players have been impactful, but really, with the exception of their goaltender Albert Zituni and a few other forwards and defensemen here, they're really not losing that many pieces. And I'd put them in a very similar situation as when I get to Hank. I'll talk about them, saying that they're not losing so many players either, but neither is YDE, and they're the team we're talking about now. I don't think that YDE is going to be as bad going into next year as many people are thinking, because when next year's varsity team, or what will be next year's varsity team, had a JV team 2 years prior, they only went 1-9 or 1-8-1. And I know a lot of people are coming into the year probably thinking that, YDE only went 1-8-1 or 1-9. The team that will be next year's varsity team, when they were JV, that was their record, and they shouldn't be too tough. I'm telling you right now, their teams have been improving year after year and in dramatic fashion. And I think that they could be on a big rise come next year. And I'm interested to see what happens there. They're also going to get some of their 10th graders next year they'll be 11th graders, but this year's 10th graders who are on a playoff team on the JV level. So it'll be interesting to see how those players shake out for them on the varsity level and what kind of impacts they can make. And we'll find out what happens once we get there, but we got to get there first. We're going to move on to the next team, and that's Flatbush. Flatbush went 7-7 during the regular season. They were 1 point shy of making the playoffs with 14, and the margin to get in was 15. And Flatbush, if you heard in my award show, obviously they have one of the co-MVPs in Joey Catton. And Joe Catton is an absolutely incredible player. He's a full-on, full-out game breaker. Does everything, kills penalties, scores goals, sets people up for plays. He's an overall playmaker, and he can do it all. And he's also versatile. He can play offense, defense, power play, penalty kill, any position, any time, any scenario or situation. He's the guy who Flatbush, in my opinion, would be looking at and saying, okay, this is our guy who's going to lead our team next year, and he's going to do everything again. Not just because he did it this past year, but because people know he can and people know he will. It doesn't matter who is on him, who he's playing against. He'll find a way to do it against everyone. He did this past year with a team that actually, believe it or not necessarily is as strong on paper as the team they will have next year, because 2 years ago, and I say 2 years ago, again, referring to not this past JV season, but the one before, but when what will be next year's Flatbush varsity team was a JV team, they were a playoff team, and they played really well against an SAR team that ended up beating them in the quarterfinals and making it to the semis. But that Flatbush team had some good pieces. They had they had obviously Joe Catton and his line mate Eli Gindy. They had some good freshman players on that team as well, guys like Johnny Garbalski and Simon Weiss. Now, both those guys were sophomores this past year, and Simon Weiss transferred to Ramaz, and unfortunately Ramaz does not have a varsity team, so we won't be talking about them in this episode. But, as I mentioned, there are guys up and down the lineup who can, who were around for that JV team, and also not to mention Flatbush's middle school. In all likeliness, I would like to assume at least that they're probably only going to have a varsity team next year, because that's what they've done, really, with the exception of just when this team was a JV team that will be next year's varsity team, that they've only had a varsity team. So some of these guys have been getting varsity experience as younger guys like 9th and 10th graders. And this past year's Flatbush middle school team just went to the semis and lost to Hafter in overtime. Hafter, if you caught in my JV episode and I talked about them, they had a perfect season. Flatbush was right there with them, and they had some very good players, some impactful players on the middle school level who might be able to come up. And I'm not telling you will, but very possibly may end up seeing a little bit of time next year, could learn from some of the guys on this team, like a Joe Catton, like an Eli Gindi, like a Jaime Antebe, and we'll see what happens there. I'm also a pretty big believer in a guy like Asher Malamed, who 2 years ago won a Breakout Player Award, if I'm not mistaken, for one of the better defensemen in the league, who people sort of slept on. He'll be on the varsity team next year, and he should be an impact player for them next year. So Flatbush is an interesting looking team. Next year, they'll definitely have guys who can score goals and guys who can help keep the ball out of their net on the back end. And also, Omer Yadov will be one of the better goalies in the league next year. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with them going forward. Obviously, it would have been a little bit nicer if we could have had Avidan Berman here to break down the situation. That was his team the last couple of years, but he wasn't here. And that's really everything that we have up on them, up until this point. And we're going to move on to the next team in the standings, moving again from bottom to top again. And that's going to be Rambam. Rambam this year had a pretty solid regular season. 7-6-1 might not indicate that. However, a win in the playoffs on the road in MTA with a 5-0 win. Zevi Herskowitz, a 5-goal game. Rami Kesak with a shutout. And similar to Joe Catton, I mentioned, Zevi Herskowitz also, he's a co-MVP with Joe Catton this past season. And again, want to congratulate them also, as well as everyone who won awards or who was nominated for awards. But at the same time, Zevi Herskowitz will not be returning next year because he's graduating, and or probably by this point in time, by the time this episode comes out, will have probably graduated already. And with that being said, Ramam's going to be losing a big piece in their goal scoring, with that piece missing now. And, it's interesting because they are going to be losing, this team was a majority 12th grade team. They're going to be losing guys on the back end like Yona Greenfield and Shmuel Fader. And they're going to be still losing guys on the offensive side other than Zevi Herskowitz, guys like Donnie Mayer and Mendel Rosenberg. And all those guys played huge roles for them. Also a guy in defense like Avi Barningham. Those were really like their main core of guys who really carried the team within the field players. And obviously you have Rami Kesak in net, who will be on the team next year as a senior because he's only a junior this year. However, there's not a ton of bodies coming up from the JV level for next year. And as I mentioned in the JV episode, guys who will be on the move up to varsity, guys like Moshe Holtzer, Elon Klein, Moshe Feldman, and Isaac Massery will all come in and play roles. However, will they be able, and the question is going to be, will they be able to take on the roles that are being left and all the holes, will they be able to fill those holes that are being left by the guys who are departing, like a Zevi Herskowitz, like Iona Greenfield, like a Mendel Rosenberg, so on and so forth. And it will be interesting to see. 2 years ago, when next year's varsity team was JV team, they were not fantastic, only went 1-8-1. However, they were in most games and they didn't lose many of the games by more than a goal or two. Obviously, a big part of that was Rami Kesak being in net, but another part of it being that they were a younger team. They didn't have so much experience, more 9th graders on the team than 10th graders. Next year, there will be more 11th and 12th graders. And but now that we have now that we've seen sort of them building that experience a little bit more. And Moshe Holtzer, even though the team didn't necessarily have a better season, scored more goals. And so did Elon Klein. And Moshe Feldman became better with his skill as a defenseman, as well as Isaac Massery, despite the fact the team didn't end up playing so well. Obviously, the trade-off was they didn't have Rami Kesak on the JV level for them this past year. I think it'll be interesting to see what they do going forward. And I think that there's a way that they can find a way to have a much better season than they did when they were in JV, only on the varsity level. Also, more games allows for more opportunities to potentially win more games. At the same time, you can potentially lose more games. So we'll see what happens when next season comes around. Either way, we're going to move on to the next team, and that's Mag and David. Mag and David also, like Rambam, went 7-6-1, but they own the tiebreaker over them this year. And the truth of the matter is that Mag and David only had a varsity team this year. So they did have also some players on this roster who were in 9th and 10th grade. However, the majority of their roster was made up of 12th and 11th graders. And the majority of the guys who really contributed were 12th graders. And you're looking at guys on that list. Obviously, you're looking at the big name of Henry Towle. You're looking at another big name over there with Felix Hadoff, another one in a Ralph Gindi, another one with a Morris Cohen. Jesse Cohen, their goaltender, is going to be out. Albert Cohen. There are a lot of Cohens on this team, and that's why I remember so many. And with that being said, they are going to be losing a good amount of those guys. The unfortunate thing for Mag and David is while they're losing those guys and they didn't have so many guys from their 9th and 10th grade class because they just weren't, they didn't have so many bodies, is the fact that their middle school team didn't have so many 8th graders either. So they're not really going to be gaining anyone. All signs point to, at least for me right now, are pointing towards the fact, which I brought up in JV, and I guess I'll bring it up right now, saying that, again, I'm doing this not 100% sure, which teams will be around next year, if teams are going to opt out of having a team after having had one this past season or in years past, or which teams that didn't have a varsity team this year might end up coming back into the varsity league. So I'm not sure. But again, back to Mag and David, all signs, unfortunately, in what I would predict right now, point to them not necessarily being able to put together a varsity team next year. But that's dependent. Maybe guys who could have played will come back and play. Again, I'm not sure. I'm not writing them off, but that's really just everything that I have to be able to go off of right now. And unfortunately, I would never want to see any of these teams leave the league. I think more teams makes it more competitive, more fun. Obviously, it's more content. But with that being said, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with them. And, like I was talking about it with Ramaz earlier in the JV episode that you guys probably have seen by now. And if not, go check that out. That I will say, maybe having so many unknowns, if Mag and David does in fact have a team next year, and because they don't have so many guys that people really know, will actually be an advantage to them because of the fact that no one's really going to know how to play against them, and it may work out for them. So that'll be interesting to look out for, and we will see once we get there. But with that being said, we're going to move on to the next team in the standings, and that is Hafter. As I was talking about in the JV episode, I think Hafter's JV team has a very, very good chance next year to be able to make a run. Hafter's varsity team is a little bit different. I'm not writing them off, however, and I did talk about it when I mentioned Max Newmark in the award show because he was a big piece for them, that they're going to be a tough team to beat on the varsity level, obviously, with a goalie like Max Newmark, who can steal a game from any team, no matter who it is, on his own, because we've seen him do it in the past, and there's no reason to believe he won't be able to do it going forward, especially when he's only gotten better. However, this Hafter team is going to be losing, similar to Mag and David, a lot of key pieces that were mostly 12th graders. And they did not only have a varsity team this year. They did have a JV team this year. However, they are going to be getting some additions there, and I'll talk about that real quick. But first, just to mention some of the names of guys we could see on the way out who are big impact players. Some obviously a guy like Joshua Abramov was a big player for them. Jacob DeMarco, who was a big forecheck player for them. Jonah Fish, James Goldschmidt are both going to be out for them this coming year. And obviously, as I mentioned, Jacob Wolf and Jonah Olener, who are two of the better players in the league, just as they're pure position players. Jacob Wolf on defense, Jonah Olener on offense. I also want to throw in Shlomo Young, who was one of the best penalty killers in the league this past year. And overall, those are a lot of key pieces for them that will be out. Now, in terms of names that'll still be around for them, they're still going to have a guy like Alex Ernst, who can be a forechecking menace and a big penalty killer, a good chaser for them. They're going to have Jack Krupp back next year, in all likeliness, at least after he did not play for most of the season to begin, but ended up joining the team late. They're still going to obviously have the Newmark twins on their team. So Max Newmark and net, Zach Newmark, who has really developed into one of the better overall, just great, fundamentally sound players in the league after making the transition to play defense from offense. And as I mentioned, we will talk about some of the guys coming up from JV, and now I'll take the time to mention some of those names. A guy like Zachy Weiss, a guy like Matty Blonder, who might not necessarily get some time in net, but will certainly learn a lot from playing behind a guy like Max Newmark. And it's going to be a very interesting team for them looking at next year. And I certainly don't think you can write them off. However, the question for me is, will they have the same level of success going into next year's varsity team or next year's varsity league that they had this past year, which was a very, very solid season. Remember, they went 9-5. And they were right there, they were really right there for a period and a half, 2 periods against Frisch, and then it all fell apart for them. So it will be interesting to see what happens with them next year. And again, like I said, whenever you have a goalie in net like Max Newmark, you can never write a team off. Similar situation to what I said with Rambam. They're losing a lot of pieces. We don't know what their guys coming up from JV will necessarily bring them, but we know one thing. You're going to have to beat Rami Kesak. It's the same situation here. You're going to have to beat Max Newmark. And again, he could steal a game from anyone. There's no question about that, and there's no reason to believe he won't do it against anyone because he's done it against anyone. So with that being said, we're going to move on to the next team in our standings. We have 2 left to talk about from the Eastern Conference, and the next one is Hank. Hank had a very strong regular season. They went 12-2. And as I mentioned, when I talked about a team like YDE, and I said, they're really not losing so many pieces, or at least so many impactful pieces for them. It's a very similar situation with Hank. The 2 most impactful players who Hank is losing from this past year's varsity team are Yoni Lovi and Ellie Schwartz. They were the 2 first-line offensive defenseman for them. They were both outstanding for them. And this isn't a knock on anyone else who was a 12th grader on this Hank team. I'm not really sure if there really were any other 12th graders on this Hank team from this past season. I apologize. But with that being said, and it could be that Lovie and Schwartz were, but if they were, then the rest of the team played so solid all season long, and all around they got contributions from everyone in the lineup. I mentioned it very briefly towards the end of the JV, what we can expect to see for next year episode. And when I talked about Hank saying, they haven't had a JV team, if you made a JV team out of all the guys who'd be eligible to play JV with their grade, being in those grades, they would have a really solid team. And some of them got very good time this year, very good amounts of playing time this year. And next year, I would expect them to get more and to blossom. And as I mentioned, Hank's middle school team, assuming Hank only has a varsity team next year, has guys that would be able, not a ton of guys who are just coming in general, but the ones that will be able to come in and contribute already, even on a varsity level. And for pieces they'll have sticking around next year, there are a lot to name off. But obviously, you're going to be looking at a guy. You're going to be looking at a guy, as I mentioned, like Elliot Hockey. You're going to be looking at a guy like Isaac Marilis. You're going to be looking at Elon Kogel. You're going to be looking at Jojo Talit. All of these guys are absolutely phenomenal players. Those are sort of your core four for next year. I'm also a big believer in Josh Frankel and net. He's really blossomed into a good goalie, a very good goalie, after being sort of a little more on the, people would say, mediocre side, but I wouldn't say he was necessarily considered to be mediocre because he wasn't good. He just never really had so much experience. And once he got that opportunity in his 10th grade year last year, when Joey Diamond got injured and he had to play against the big dogs like DRS and Frisch and TABC, just to name a couple, for example, he really played well, and it blossomed from there. He came in as the starting goaltender for them this past year. I know E10 Holtzman was a 9th grader, by the way. He's a guy who was able to contribute for them, ended up getting more playing time down the stretch and in the playoffs, but Josh Frankel's not a guy you could sleep on. I would still be looking at him as the number one guy going into the varsity league for next year for Hank. And they're also going to still have guys, obviously, around who are 9th graders this past year, like Avi Hackle, Mo Ackerman, Judah Weitzman. All of these guys were able to contribute at big moments. Also, Isaac Silberger. I know I left him off the list. My apologies there. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this Hank team. I certainly think, though, that, considering they're only really losing 2 players, really just possibly in general, being in Yoni Lovie and Ellie Schwartz, that this is a team that will certainly be back in the mix for a run at the championship next year. And with that being said, we'll move on to the final team from the East, and that's DRS. DRS was the championship winner from this past season. They had a record of 13-1, and this team had a great mix of 11th and 12th graders, but we know that they are still going to have a very strong roster for next year. If you look at their season 2 years ago, I keep saying it, next year's varsity team, when they were in JV, they went to the championship. They went 9-1, lost in overtime. And many of the guys, obviously, from this past year's championship run, who were probably the difference makers between the 2 classes, between the 11th and 12th grade, are going to be on the way out. You're looking at the game MVP from the championship, Daniel Austin. He's going to be out. You're looking, obviously, at Nathaniel Lawrence, their leading defenseman, who is going to be out. Jake Frankel is going to be out. They're looking at Ben Ritter and a guy like, you're looking at a guy like Ben Ritter. He's going to be on the way out. Also, Jack Weisald, another goaltender for them. He's going to be on his way out. All of these guys are graduating. Ariel Rogoff, Ariel Mayer, Eitan Katz. These were all guys that had significant roles for DRS. However, there are plenty of other names that will still be in the mix for them who were impact players this year, still on the junior side of things. And you're looking at guys like Moshe Aryeh and Jack Greenbaum, who are 2 outstanding players when paired together. And just in general, obviously, Ellis Bornstein, one of the most dynamic and one of the most skilled players, pure skilled players in the entire league, not just to be expected for next year, but, this past year as well. Obviously, you're still going to have the likes of Micha Khan and Yitzi Yudin and Donnie Ostreicher, Max Pokris. Josh Papilski is going to be very huge for them in net next year. I would certainly not expect to see this team really take that much regression, if any at all. And on the 10th graders, for the 10th graders moving up from this past JV season, who will be 11th graders next year for varsity, obviously you're going to have the likes for returning players such as Josh Lampert and Ami Marks and Zevi Fuchs. Those were their big 3 this past season. And they're going to get other guys out of the mix. Daniel Wogelernter, as I mentioned, will be competing with Josh Papilski, or at least I'd have to assume after the season he will likely be competing with Josh Papilski for that starting goaltending role for the Wildcats next season on the varsity level. This is still going to be a very good team next year. There's no doubt in my mind about that. The question is how good can they be? Can they repeat as champions? Will they be that good? Or are they just going to fall a little bit short? Will they fall even shorter than maybe just a little bit short? I'm not sure. We won't know until we get there, obviously. But all signs, at least for me, point to a very successful overall all-around season for DRS next year. With that being said, we're going to move to the Western Conference now, and we're going to, again, start from the bottom and work our way up towards the top. So in the bottom, we have Hillel, and we also have JEC. And since they were so close together record-wise and also play-wise, I'm going to put them in the same category, and we'll talk about them together. The truth of the matter is that neither of these teams have really had a ton of success, just over the last bunch of years as a whole, not just this past year. They haven't always been in the league, consistently these last couple of years consecutively. However, just as a whole, there really hasn't been much talk about either of these sides or either of these teams, getting many players or really any players. Obviously, we won't know until the next season begins. However, at least not to my knowledge, I don't believe that either of these teams had JV teams from 2 years ago, or what will be next year's varsity teams would have had JV teams from that year. So I really just don't have anything on either of these teams right now. And the only thing that we can do at this point is just wait until next season comes around and see what happens, because there is no track record from either of these sides. In terms of from this past year and players that they may or may not be losing, when you talk about Hillel actually had a roster of decent size, and they only had, I don't believe that they had many 12th graders, if I remember correctly. It's possible maybe that they didn't even have any. If that's the case, then Hillel was really a younger team this year. And, to only end up with one win in the standings all season long, it's a learning experience. If they have a majority 9th and 10th grade team for an entirely varsity, only a varsity team there, then it really shows, there's a lot of potential for that team. Certainly maybe in another 2 or 3 years, maybe even next year. We'll see when that happens. However, I obviously can't be putting them as a team. I can't be putting them down as a team yet that I expect to compete for a championship without really much to show for it yet. As for JEC, JEC does have a couple of 12th graders that they will be losing. However, again, also a good mix of really mostly 9th, 10th, and 11th graders. So also similar situation to Hillel, how because they don't have so many 12th graders and they were a team that only ended up with 2 wins during the regular season, it will be interesting to see what happens with them going forward. Most of their players are in 10th and 11th grade, a good mix of 9th graders in there as well. So can they take another step forward, maybe be in playoff contention next year? I'm not sure. Again, we're not 100% sure. I'm not 100% sure, at least on either of these teams, considering they didn't have JV teams from 2 years, what will end up being 2 years prior to what will be next year's varsity teams. And that's really just all I can say on it for now. Which is going to move us on to the next team in the standings in Ori Sral next year will have an interesting varsity team, because 2 years ago, or what will be 2 years ago from next year's varsity team, their JV team was very, very close to making the playoffs. And obviously they had some big pieces on that team. They still had obviously Aiden Petak leading the way for them. And they had a guy like Ruben Rosada who was on there as well. And they had a guy also like Noah Froman, who was on that team for them, doing really big things for them and being a huge contributor. Where it's going to be interesting for me now is the addition of a guy like Jack Abramson, who wasn't on that team 2 years ago because he was in TABC and played on that undefeated team that had a perfect season and won the championship. So you're getting another good player into the mix there. And look, maybe the way I see it, they were really just like one more player away from making the playoffs. And whenever you make the playoffs, you know how it goes. You just need to get in to give yourself a chance. And who knows? I'm not telling you they would have beaten TABC if Jack Abramson wasn't on TABC. I'm not telling you they would have beaten a team like SAR or Flatbush or Kushner or Frisch or whoever it was. I'm just saying that, at the end of the day, next year is going to be an interesting year for them, because they, again, had the majority of their players were in 9th through 11th grade. Not many 12th graders on the Ori Sral team. And even though they only went 4-9, they played pretty competitively throughout the regular season, even against teams like a TABC, like a Frisch, like a Rambam, like a DRS, anyone. And it's going to be interesting to see what that team does next year. And we will have to wait until we get there to see what happens. And we're going to move on to SAR now, who is the next team that we'll talk about. SAR went 7-7 during the regular season, cracked the 5 seed for the playoffs in the Western Conference this past year. SAR is going to be an absolute powerhouse next year, or at least all signs for me point to them being a powerhouse. They were 2 years ago when this next year's varsity team was a JV team. They went 8-2 during that regular season and made it to the semis, had the lead late in the game against DRS in DRS and almost went to the championship. And similar to the way that I said it earlier on when I spoke about Hafter in the JV episode, and I said sometimes teams will go through a big loss before they can win big. And after losing in the semifinals in overtime, after blowing the lead in the semifinals and, after blowing the lead late in regulation in the semifinals and then losing in overtime, was their way of losing to understand what they can sort of tighten up and capitalize and be better at for next year so that they can be the ones at the top of the league when they have their shot. And they're going to have their shot next year in JV, as I mentioned. But enough of Hafter, because this is not talking about Hafter and it's not talking about JV. We're talking about SAR on the varsity level here. SAR is not going to be losing so many pieces from their senior class. However, there are going to be a few notable names in there. Obviously, a guy like Sam Lukashuk, who won Breakout Player in the West, a guy like Asher Rudman, who was nominated for one of the 3rd All-Team Offenseman position awards in the West. Obviously, these are 2 guys who are going to be big names that they're losing. I also don't want to shy away from a guy like Benji Barretts, who was a big role player for them this past year, and Jake Goldman, who was also a big role player for them this past year on the defensive side of things. However, the majority of this SAR team was in 11th grade. And you're still going to have guys around like Max Baker. You're still going to have a guy around like Mo Jeter, a guy around like Elijah Kuehl, Ari Levine, all of these guys. Sammy Glass is going to be another big piece that they still have. Henry Wolf, who came back in the middle of the year to keep playing for them. And obviously, they're also going to have the incredibly talented 10th graders from this past year coming back up who were phenomenal as 9th graders. Guys like Jack Linhart, Nate Zitter, Michael Goldman, Ellie Fenster, Jacob Rosenstein. All of these guys are moving up next year, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with next year's varsity SAR team, and especially now that they have, as I mentioned, a guy like Elijah Kuehl thrown into the mix. As I mentioned, Ori Sral was just about 1 player away potentially from making it into the playoffs. SAR might have been 1 player away, and a guy like Elijah Kuehl missing from their roster away from maybe going to the championship. Maybe that's all it would have taken, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens, especially with the addition of Elijah Kuehl in SAR next year. So all signs, in my opinion, point to SAR having a very, very good season next year on the varsity level. We're going to move on to the next team in the standings, and that's MTA. MTA finished 4th in the West this past year, 7-6-1 during the regular season, lost in the quarterfinals, and so to speak, the wild card game to Rambam that they hosted. They lost 5-0. Zevi Herskowitz, as I mentioned, scored all 5 goals in that game. Rami Kesak had the shutout, and MTA really could not get much going. There is some good news as well as some bad news. And I guess we'll start with the bad news is that, this was a team that had a little bit higher of a ceiling, at least in my opinion, than what they actually got with some of the players they had this year. The good news for them is that a lot of these players will be returning. They're not going to be losing so many players. And a little bit more good news for them is that they will have some 10th graders from this past year's JV team coming up who can certainly make an impact and help that varsity team next year, because next year's varsity team, when they were a JV team, made the playoffs, had a strong regular season, and was very close. They were 1 goal away from going to the semifinals. They lost 3-2 to North Shore in the quarters and played a better game. I was there and it was a great game, but they played a better game than North Shore. And quite honestly, I still believe, even though it's well past the time at this point, that they were the team that deserved to make it to the semifinals, the way that game played out. However, it didn't happen that way. And similar to how I said, teams will eventually, most of the time you see that a team goes through a really, really tough loss before they can learn to win big. Maybe that was it for MTA. It'll be interesting to see. Just to name a couple of the guys who obviously MTA will be losing this year, I don't want to shy away from guys like E10 Cantor, like Avi Glick, there was another one on this team that I really can't remember. Like Jesse Morgan, their goaltender, who was absolutely outstanding, and Ariel Gantrow. All these guys, as I mentioned, not very many of them, but impact players for a playoff team. That's a very successful season and a bunch of solid overall players there. None of them really necessarily game breaking, but solid. And you don't always need a game-breaking player to be a super successful team. However, they're still going to have guys around. As I mentioned, the guys who will be departing, there will still be guys around, obviously, like Chaim Simon, like Noam Sheffy, like Shua Radsker, like a guy coming up in Moshe Krah and Ozzie Dreyfus to help, sort of even out the goaltending battle, the goaltending situation for them there. Like, more is around for this team. And they will be, I would like to believe at the very least, that they will be in the mix to not only make the playoffs, but to make a run in the playoffs. Again, I'm not saying anyone here is necessarily going to win the championship while saying this, maybe one or two very specific cases, but I would not be writing this MTA Lions team off next year by any means. They are certainly going to be in the mix and at the very least going to be playing competitive games against everyone next year. And with that being said, we're going to move on to the next team in the standings, and that's going to be Kushner. I talked a little bit about it in the awards show and in the season recap for the varsity level because Kushner didn't have a JV team this past year. But Kushner is one of those teams that I see, again, there wasn't a lot of depth on this team as a whole, but for the players they had this year, they had a good run. And just to name a couple of the guys who will be on their way out, they're going to be losing a good defenseman in Sean Felderman. They're going to be losing one of the better offensemen in the league in Sam Steiner. However, and also a guy like Jacob Schnipper, who was also one of the better overall offensemen in the league. But when all is said and done, you're also going to be looking at guys who are going to be around, like James Orbach, who will be one of the best individual offensemen, one of the best overall offensemen in the league next year, one of the best defensemen in the league next year, like Kobe Eisenberg. They're going to have Simon Rosenfeld in net for them. As I mentioned, there is your one offense, one defense, one goalie, like 1A, 1A, 1A in all of those positions respectively. If they can get a little bit more support around those positions, other than the three guys they have total who will be leading those positions, those are guys you can build around. Those are guys who can help carry the core, carry the team for next year. Again, not telling you this team is going to win the championship next year, but I'm not writing this team off by any means. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens. Also, maybe the depth can get a little bit more, maybe the depth will expand a little bit more for them. They haven't always been known to be such a deep team. But next year with the guys who are leading the helm, they might not need to be as deep with those guys, now playing in their senior years after having done it on a high level for multiple years and having been so successful doing it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Kushner next year, and that's for sure. Moving on to the next team that we have to talk about, it's Frisch. Frisch went 10-4 this past regular season, and next year's varsity team that will be Frisch's team, when they were in JV, missed the playoffs by a slim margin. I think they missed it by 1 point and were just barely on the outside looking in. And this is a team that is going to be losing some big pieces, especially guys who came and played for the first time this year who are impactful. Guys like Max Levy and David Rosen. And also a guy, obviously, like Charlie Hilbert, a guy like Tal Glassman, Jacob Weiss. These are all very, very solid players for this first team. I also don't want to take away from a guy like Dovey Jacobs, who was a good leader for this team, and a guy also like Adam Haim, who was a good leader for this team. However, they are going to have, and they did have, a good mix of 11th and 12th graders this year on the varsity team. Next year, they will have a good mix of 11th and 12th graders as well, because the 10th grade class moving up is going to have some guys who will definitely be able to contribute on the varsity level next year as 11th graders. And some of the 11th graders from this past year will be the seniors next year for them, certainly are going to be huge pieces for them, and many of them are sticking around. Guys on defense like Ryan Bugsbayev and Nathaniel Cohen, E10 Fine, as I mentioned in that list. A.B. Fields on offense is going to be one of the most dominant offensemen in the league next year. You're still going to have a guy around like Eli Khan, who is huge for them. You're still going to have a guy around like Noah Lowe, who's playing big minutes for them at times. Akiva Rotenberg is going to be one of the best overall goalies in the league. This is going to be a very solid overall team. At least I would like to believe they will be a very solid overall team next year. And they're still going to be coached by one of the top coaches in all of the league, if not the top coach in all the league in varsity, in Jaak Lisker. And we've seen this sort of trend with Frisch over the last bunch of years, where the JV teams, and again, this is nothing against any particular coach or pumping any particular coach's tires, but it's just been a trend over the last 3 or 4 seasons, really since the end of COVID, and even before COVID began, that Frisch's JV teams, no matter how successful or how unsuccessful they were, always got better, no matter what, always got better and improved tremendously once they hit the varsity level. And, a great example of that would be from this past year. This past year's Frisch team went to the semis and was a goal away from going to the championship. They held DRS to 2 goals, lost 2-1 in a game they may have even outplayed them in. And with that being said, 2 years before that, they got absolutely smoked in the first round by Hafter. And by the way, if no one remembers, they beat Hafter, by 6 goals in the first round this year. They beat them 8-2. So, just to show, again, the reference that these Frisch teams, when moving on from JV to varsity, have only gotten better. I would certainly expect that trend to continue. I'm not putting the pressure on anyone by saying that, or at least I hope I'm not. I'm not saying it for that purpose. I'm saying it because it's something we've seen. I would not be surprised if it continues next year, and if this Frisch team is even more dominant than they were on the JV level when next year's varsity team is mirroring what they were 2 years ago on the JV level. Now, with that being said, we're going to move on to the final team we have to talk about today, and that's TABC in the varsity league. TABC went 12-2, lost in the championship to DRS this year. And look, they are going to have a bunch, a handful of very, very impactful players who will be graduating. Obviously, big names like Shea Fields, Matis Kraus, Ezra Alter, Max Borger, Amichai Dresner, Ari Herman. However, they are going to have a lot of returning names from this past year for next year. And some of those guys, just to name a couple of them who we're all quite familiar with, guys like Jonathan Brothman, Aryeh Simon, Ethan Moskoff, Aryeh Isakovitz, Ben Sion Kaiser, Aiden Rausman. Shia Forgash is going to be taking over in goal next year, or at least I'd like to believe he'll be taking over in goal next year on the varsity level. And not just to take over, but will be one of the top goalies in the league. This is a team that is going to have a lot of firepower next year. This 11th grade class, I would say, is probably the most talented bunch of pure talent. 11th graders that are all bunched into one school, all bunched onto one team. That's just the way it played out. And with that being said, they are still going to be getting some guys from the JV level from this past year who were 10th graders next year as varsity guys in 11th grade who will be able to make an impact. Guys like Benjamin Kornick and Jaden LaFell, who I talked about on the JV level for TABC this past year, will be moving up and can maybe make impacts on the varsity level. And obviously, Nathaniel Cal moving up to learn under Shia Forgash. Again, it's going to be a very, very, very strong team, at least I'd like to believe, for TABC next year. Part of that being because of who's still around from this year that made this team have a really good year and really contributed to the success they had despite just falling short in the championship. And in addition to that, because next year's TABC varsity team from 2 years ago won the championship and had a perfect season. They did it. They went 10-0 and they ended up with a banner at the end of the year, and it wasn't a second place banner. Let's just leave it at that. So I think TABC is in for a very, very strong season next year, and we'll see if they can get back to being champions, because TABC, we know, big hockey school, high expectations year in, year out. They almost never disappoint to, give themselves a chance. Question is going to be, can they do it? And with that being said, that is going to bring episode number 10 to an end, and it is our final episode, once again, as I'm mentioning, of season 3 for Yeshiva League Pass Faceoff. So I want to thank you all for tuning into this episode of Yeshiva League Pass Faceoff. I want to thank you all for tuning in all season to every episode of Yeshiva League Pass Faceoff, and I really appreciate every single one of you guys who has really helped us grow this, this overall podcast, and really just, want to make it even better every single time. We always love the feedback, obviously, but even more so, we would not be here without the great work of many people. And I know they're not going to want me to say their names, but really everyone who has made this possible from Yeshiva League Pass, everyone who has made this possible from working around the league, obviously Commissioner Seth Gordon for doing such a great job, obviously all the referees, all the coaches, and especially the players, all of the principals, who have done such a great job running their student bodies and being so supportive of all of these teams. And in fact, it would be obviously very, very scary if I would leave off our incredible sponsor, the Weiselberg Law Firm. And I want to remind everyone, again, we are sponsored by the Weiselberg Law Firm. Choose wisely. Thank you all so much for another fantastic season. I'm your host, Josh Cass, saying so long, and hopefully we will see you back next season.